Here.
Here.
Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Okay, the first item on our agenda is authorization to apply for a Brownfields grant for remediation of the ball and socket property. Mr. Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Be it resolved that the Town Council approves Resolution Number 092121-1. Be it resolved that the Town Council authorizes application for a grant in the amount of $925,000 via the State of Connecticut's Department of Economic and Community Development Municipal Brownfield Grant Program on behalf of Ball and Socket Arts.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. There's a second. Thank you, Mr. Veliver. Mr. Walsh?
This is another grant that they are applying for with the help of the town to help with remediation projects at the ball and socket property located at 493 West Main. Its application is being developed jointly by the town staff and members of the ball and socket organization. It's is being sought to complete interior remediation and closure of existing canals within Building 1, abate asbestos roofing material, and stabilize certain portions of the structure as coordinated by the licensed environmental professional and project architect engineer.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Questions or comments from members of the council? Mr. Jinks?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is this a continuation of the grant they're currently operating under, or is it a new grant, or what's, I'm just not sure about the sort of sequence.
I know we have Andrew Martelli here, but it's my understanding, Mr. Jinks, this is a new grant. So that is correct? Okay. Any other questions or comments? You all set, Mr. Jinks?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Mr. Slocum?
To what extent would this be nearing completion of this, or is this part, 2 of 5?
Is this on? Hello? Can you hear me? Yeah, there you go. So currently the project they're about done with phase 1, which is building 2, which is the barn building on the corner of West Main Street and Willow. So that building will open in the spring of 2022. So this is for the next phase. And so this work will be in building number 1, which is the main structure on the site. So inside that building, there's open canals from remediation work that had been taking place over several years back under the other ownership. So this will finish that work, seal that floor, and then abate the rest of the roof structure, which has asbestos, tar paper, and et cetera, other hazardous building materials. So then it'll kind of give us a weather tight envelope on building number 2 for future phases.
Thank you, Mr. Martelli.
Sure.
Mr. Slocum, you're all set? Other questions or comments? Yes, Mr. Veliver.
Andrew, you mentioned closing the envelope for, is that, and I think maybe goes a little further up on Tim's question. Once this work is done, will that make then building 1 more? Can we get to a point where that can be completed, or is there more remediation work that comes after that before further work can be done?
There's additional work that'll need to take place in building number 1 to have it ready for occupants. So back in 2020, there was a Brownfield grant for 1.7. I think it was just shy of $2 million that was applied for that they did not receive. So this is through the same Brownfield program. So they're going back, and this is just revised a little bit to try to get some of the work done, but understanding that the first one was turned down because it was a little bit too aggressive, because there's only $17 million statewide for brownfield remediation projects this funding round. So trying to get some of this work done in the hopes of, once they have proof of concept, having the building open with sweet clods in the spring, that they can go after some conventional type financing for future phases of work on the property. So it's a long, it's like a $17-18 million project. So they're kind of taking it by chunk after chunk.
Good. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Veliver. Any other questions from members of the council? I'm certainly in favor of supporting this tonight. We've shown that in the past as a council. I think this is a strategic area for our community, and I think it lends itself to some quality redevelopment over time that will really enhance our community. So again, I'm happy to support it. The only thing that I would like to mention to you, Andrew, and to Sean is that we make sure, it was my understanding that the prior one we did was somewhat of a pass-through grant where we were supportive of it, but we were very limited in liability or no liability. And I want to make sure that's the case, that we're not putting the taxpayers in a libelous position in any way, shape, or form relative to this. So can you talk to our town attorney and make sure before something gets executed that he's involved to ensure that we are protected in a way that we're comfortable?
Absolutely.
Yeah, we'll be doing exactly that. It is the same grant program as before, similar pass-through situation. But as you suggest, prior there was a agreement with Ball and Socket that was worked out to codify the liability arrangement. We want to make sure the new town attorney has an opportunity to review that, add any additions to it or any tweaks that he'd like to see, and then we'll certainly do that long before this is hopefully awarded and then accepted and appropriated by the council if they are successful.
Great. Thank you. That's exactly what I'm thinking. I want to make sure Jeff has his eyes on this as our new town attorney. Great. Thank you. Appreciate it. If there's no other questions or comments, I'll call for a vote. All those in favor? Motion passes unanimously, or those that are here. Thank you. We'll move on to item 4, acceptance and appropriation of a $15,000 donation from the John G. Martin Foundation to police gift account for the purchase of a drone. Mr. Barwi.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Be it resolved that the Town Council approves Resolution 092121-2. Be it resolved that the Town Council accepts and appropriates a $15,000 donation from the John G. Martin Foundation to the police gift account for the purchase of a drone.
Thank you, Mr. Barwi. Thank you, Mr. Jenks. Mr. Barwi?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, the generosity of this foundation, having Cheshire connections is wonderful. I think this is going to be a very useful tool for our police department to have, and many law enforcement agencies do have them and find them of great use.
Thank you, Mr. Barwi. Questions or comments from members of the council? Yes, Mr. Slocum.
I agree. It's a fantastic gift. I do have a question. Are there limitations on how and where the police are able to exercise the use of a drone, or is it okay? I mean, everyone deals with warrants. I didn't know if they were subject to that.
Sure. So it's a great question, and those will be worked out. I was talking to the police chief just earlier this week. This is before they would purchase the drone, we would want to make sure that we've had full policies and procedures developed, manual training, everything that we would need to make sure we're comfortable with all of that before going forward with the purchase. So the chief has informed me that that's something they're actively working on and reviewing what other departments have done for best practices exactly to that point.
And to follow up on that, Tim, I had the exact same concern, and Sean and I talked about this earlier today, that before it gets purchased, we will talk more about those policies and procedures. There needs to be, in my opinion, very strict policies and procedures in place as to how it's used. I do support it. I think it can be a great public safety enhancement if it's used correctly, but I want to make sure that it's not going to violate anybody's private property and be used in ways that it shouldn't be. So for me, that's a very delicate balance. And I very much appreciate this donation from the John G. Martin Foundation, but I want to make sure it's used very appropriately in this community. So I share your thoughts, Mr. Sloan. Any other questions or comments from members of the council? No? Okay, with that, I'll call for a vote. All those in favor? Motion passed unanimously, of those that are here. Move on to item 5, which is acceptance and appropriation of a $1,500 donation from the John G. Martin Foundation to the Public Safety Commission for new safety signage. Mr. Barwi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Be it resolved that the Town Council approves Resolution 092121-3. Be it resolved that the Town Council accepts and appropriates a $1,500 donation from the John G. Martin Foundation to the Public Safety Commission for new safety signage.
Thank you, Mr. Barwi. Is there a second? Thank you, Mr. Jenks. Mr. Barwi.
Again, briefly, a generous offer. These signs are very helpful around town since they were started about 25 years ago when we formed the safety committee. They've really helped with messages that are important and seasonal and timely and get changed. And that's what this is important. This is going to be able to help put some new signs out, not just have the same old one that you get stale and stop and don't notice anymore.
Thank you, Mr. Barwi. Questions or comments, members of the council? Ms. Nichols.
Just a fast comment. We really are indebted to the John G. Martin Foundation and very fortunate to be on their list of wonderful recipients of many projects, many signs, the Park and Rec sign, the fire department sign, and a lot of other things. So I definitely will support it, and with wholehearted thanks to Mr. Lohman, who continues to put forth projects on our behalf. So good project. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nichols. Other questions or comments? Seeing none, I'll call for a vote. All those in favor? Motion passed unanimously to those that are here. Move on to item 6, which is discussion regarding school modernization. We have our 2 consultants here tonight, and obviously staff from both sides, the Board of Ed and the town. Thank you all for being here again. As you all know, we're trying to have some dedicated meetings, although we did have a few items, unfortunately, tonight, which we needed to get done that were time sensitive, but we're trying to dedicate specific nights really to focus on school modernization. So thank you for being here. We've had a variety of things that we've been talking about for the last, I don't know, many months already. And I guess we spoke a week or so ago, John and Chuck, with some of the staff about, some of the items about potentially advancing the test fit on the Marion Road property. And we also talked about potentially looking at some alternatives for Humiston and the central office. And we certainly want to get into some financial discussion. Sean and Jim, I know we've got a new piece of our financial analysis, which we want to roll out tonight. So I guess I'll open it up and turn it over to our consultants to talk about, whatever you think you want to start with. Chuck or John?
There we go. Thanks, John. Need assistance there. So we did meet in our group last week with Superintendent and Mr. Orris, Mr. Slocum. There was a proposal from Moser Pylon and their original proposal to do a test fit at the Jarvis and Marion Lane, the Casartano property, I think it's called, lower. So they've been authorized to proceed with that test fit under the premise and the idea of maximizing that property and looking ways to not just put a school on there and not use it as efficiently as possible. So we did meet in this past week with Superintendent Solon and Mr. Massian and ourselves in Moser Pylon to look at the site and share those thoughts and directives from the council. So they are going to be proceeding to look at that site for a new elementary school, approximately 100,000 square feet, as well as adding roughly, we're estimating at this point, about 20,000 square feet for a central office and an alternative high school option on the site. There's going to be 2 different options, maybe 3. One that has the central office and alternative high school attached to the elementary school, but programmed so they're physically separate. They may be connected, but it'll be, separate by probably some type of a doorway, security, et cetera, and programmed as such. And then another option that has a totally separate building on that parcel. We're not sure where yet, but maximizing that facility, maximizing vehicular circulation. Looking at both Marvis and Jarvis and Marion for access points. We did talk about some of the challenges with the site. One being topography. That does have a pretty decent slope going from east to west towards the wetlands. And I think if anybody's looked at the utility map, there is a sewer line that runs more along the east side, kind of middle eastern side of the site. And we're going to take a look, try to see if we can maximize to the west of that. I think we estimated about 25 acres roughly that we can build. We are going to be, with respect to the sewer line, reaching out to town staff to see the layout of that was kind of interesting. There's a couple jogs in it, and just get a better understanding what the rhyme and reason for that is. I'm sure there is. It could be, due to gravity feed and grades for that, which is ideal for a sewer line. So we're going to be starting that process. They've been authorized to proceed with that work. And they're going to be getting going. We're expecting a rough draft the first week of October, and then some revisions in the second week. And then we'll be coordinating with the town council to review that probably towards the latter end of October with some of those options for that. So that's, we'll also look into other alternatives for Humiston, but that's been the initial effort thus far.
Yeah, we talked, Chuck, as you know, I know Mr. Barry had raised the question about the high school location and also the Park and Rec building. So I know there were some concerns from Dr. Solon and Mr. Massiana from an educational perspective relative to that. But I certainly think out of respect to Mr. Barry and for all the town council and for the community to understand, we should be looking at that and understand if it is viable or if it's not viable and why. So.
Sure. Yeah, so
Barry, I
I
assume you
think the
agree
Parks
with
and
that?
Rec building, that's, John, what, 6,400 square feet?
Yes.
Yeah, so just from a purely square footage basis, not to say it's out of the loop, I think we're estimating around 7,500 for the central office space and I believe the alternative high school. But I think we need to just look at the programming and more closely on that, and we still have to do that so that it's not an absolute out. Just it's a little bit tighter than what they have right now. But that doesn't say they can't get more efficient. So we'll still look at that. And as far as like the high school goes for the alternative high school, I think I'll defer to Dr. Solon as far as programmatically putting there at the high school. I don't think we should speak to. I think
Well, I know when we met briefly the other day that Dr. Solon and Mr. Massiana mentioned, while square footage wise, it looks like there's excess capacity from a functionality perspective. There really isn't a lot of excess space in that high school where there's classrooms that aren't being used, et cetera. And I certainly don't want to speak for you, Dr. Solon, or you, Mr. Massiana. So I think I'm paraphrasing correctly, but if I'm wrong, please let me know.
You're correct.
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
accurate.
Okay, so while we have the extra square footage, I think what we're concerned about is that there really isn't available classrooms, et cetera, in that building. And I'm not sure where we want to go with that. Mr. Barrow.
Well, if I could, the genesis of my concern with that was reading the SMC report, and I followed it pretty closely. It talks about the high school in the 10-year plan that you've done for the student enrollment at being no more than, I think it was 75% capacity, 1,200 something students, and has capacity of 1,600 students. So can some of that extra space be used? Now, Dr. Solon, we talked out in one of the meetings, said that it's possible that it may not work out quite that way because now the teachers who have a classroom may not be teaching as many classes because of the new scheduling and stuff. But I just asked the mayor and to talk to you guys to make sure that we could get this addressed, because I would hate to see some in the community think we've got a school that's going to hit no more than 75% capacity that's not being used. So, and I know functional capacity is different than educational capacity. I would just like it to be very clear whether we have space to use that or not.
Illuminate it. Yeah. Just illuminate the issue by putting together some information that helps articulate why that's not an option.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. As a side note to that, if I can, it also talks
Absolutely.
about Dodd having significant capacity availability. Is that going to have the same issue? And I'm not talking about moving these programs there. I especially don't think the alternative would work as well there, being they never left. And that would be more difficult. I could see the alternative working at the high school. I mean, Wallingford, Torrington, others have it. My wife's worked in one of them that has it, and it works perfectly fine. But I understand the educational reason for not doing it at the same grade level as well.
Moved theirs out. They have
Yeah.
separate.
But what are we going to find with Dodd? Are we going to find that they are pretty much near capacity as well? And that it may not be answerable tonight, because I know the report showed that there was not a lot of capacity there. And if it's 100 students either way, I would never want to see it say, oh no, that's a lot of capacity, let's use that up, because that's not a big number when you're dealing with 4,000 or 5,000 students, which is what the projections will be, up to 5. So I just a concern to be addressed in the near future, that we make sure that end is tied up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barry. Other questions or comments while we're on this topic? Chuck and John, the other thing we talked about, and we're talking about the test fit on the Marion Road property, we wanted to make sure we're maximizing the usability of that site. And obviously one of the options is to put Humiston out there with the main office, which I think could potentially be a nice use out there and maximize that site. We want to make sure too, as we talk, that we're designing to expand the school if and when we need expansion space. Our enrollment projections suggest that in either of these scenarios that were brought forward, that we're going to be up in the 90+% based on enrollment projections. So clearly we need to make sure we have expansion. And I think that's probably a bit of a balancing act because the state only lets you build up to a certain amount. They're not going to let you overbuild today with potentially what might happen 10 years down the road. They're going to give you some factors to build, which they'll reimburse. And that's what we've done here. Is that correct? But obviously we want to make sure we can expand those buildings relatively easily down the road if in fact we need the capacity. So
Yeah.
my point is I want to make sure we're designing for expansion, whether it be the Marion Road site or whether it be the site on the south end at Norton School or any other locations that we inevitably look at.
Yeah, 100% correct, Ms. Orris. In the test that they will delineate an area that, and again, these are schematics, so keep in mind, it's kind of high level of where they can, extend typically an academic wing. If you remember the last test fits, there's either extension of a 2-story wing, and the key thing, what's most important is if the projects do go forward with that is when we draft a request for proposal for architectural and engineering services that we delineate that when they design the building itself, that they have to keep in mind that flexibility to expand them for the utilities when they run the mechanicals and your plumbing, your hydronics and utilities throughout the building, that at the end of that corridor, if you will, if we add on, we're just scabbing into those and building that capacity. So they will be taking those into account.
And at that point, if the enrollment supports it, that next phase could be subject to reimbursement from the state of Connecticut, correct?
That is correct, because by the time, we get to this and we experienced this in South Windsor, that it was continuing to grow, and we did add expandability in the bid. We did take that, what we call a bid alternate, showing the 2 additional classrooms. We had enough funds in the budget to afford that. And then in one of the schools, we actually added 2 more, fortunately, again, due to good bid savings for that. But what's going to be important is keeping up to date with the enrollment projections throughout this process, not just for the grant application, but monitoring them each year, so that should it trend towards a growth and we're nearing the end of design, going out to construction, we'll want to know that information. Is that current number growing? And we can go back to the state and say, hey, our current numbers are X. It's indicating we need 2, 4, 6 more classrooms, and have that discussion with OSCGR and hopefully have them support that, which they have in the past.
Thank you. Mr. Walsh and Mr. Velber, did you have your hand up before? Mr. Walsh.
Thank you. Along that same lines, functional capacity, when we look at the functional capacity that based on the enrollment, during the SMC, we took the high number enrollment projections, correct, on that?
Correct.
So when we look at that 10 years out, those numbers have to be in the 90s almost, because if they're in the 70s or 80s, it means we might be overbuilding, and the state won't allow that, correct?
That's correct. Yeah. What we've seen in our experience is if they look at that space standard that we talked about in the SMC meetings, and if the space standard, which is what they say should be the building area for that enrollment, is less than 90, there starts to be a little more concern on it and wondering, okay, why are we at that? More so for the new build, because the new build, we can control that square footage, right? It's a white piece of paper. We get to control it. When it's in a renovation scenario, what they started looking is other factors such as corridors, the width of corridors, because they were wider, back, when they built them originally. And what we call unassignable space, not necessarily the classrooms, but all, your bathrooms, your lobbies might get bigger, your corridors, your mechanical spaces might be larger than what we build now. So that's something we would analyze a bit further to see why are we getting that ratio the way it is. And we also look at the actual, the shape and size of the building and if we're at 90%, they're not going to ask us typically to chop off part of the building to get there. It doesn't make any sense. It's already built. It's just understanding, okay, if we're at 90%, 89, 91, is there a rhyme and reason for that? And usually we take a look at those factors because, again, they just design them differently.
So should we be concerned when we look at numbers in the high 90s, or even one was 100%, I believe? Should we be concerned at this point, or is that really how it should be based on your projections?
If we're showing 99, 100%, over 100% is indicating a need for additional space,
Right.
Again, if we're proposing 2 new elementary schools at the beginning, those are going to be what we call right size. They're going to be designed for that 8-year maximum enrollment in the educational specification. Again, expandability that we're talking about in the later phases where they're getting to the 100, or they're 89. Again, a couple things we got to keep up to date with the enrollment and see what those trends are doing. Are they coming out the way we predicted them 3-4 years ago? Are they doing something different? But as we get to those phases, and if we, get to a referendum and later down the road, we're gonna update those enrollment projections. So that'll change, and it'll give us a more accurate of, do we actually need to expand and add on 10, 15, 20,000, whatever the square footage might be. Also, we need to look at the programming of that building too, a little bit closely, and go, as Dr. Swin was talking about the high school, they're using that program, and we just want to double check that and usually all the space is being used up for very obviously valid reasons. But the state will ask that. But yeah, we'll want to monitor that as we go.
Okay.
And as we get to that referendum point and start building that budget at ed spec, analyzing, going, okay, where do we want to add, and analyzing that, whether it's, Highland, whatever school it is.
Okay,
for it.
thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Yes, Mr. Jenks?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm really happy to see that we're talking about the projections on this proposal. It's something that I've been really concerned about from the very beginning, as you know, Chuck, and as everyone has heard me say ad nauseum. So a couple things I want to point out. The projections that we got from SLR last fall, I think it was October, November. The first year projection we received for the elementary level was for 2,185 students, and this year we're at 2,214. So in the first year, we're already exceeding that high projection they gave us. That's one thing we need to keep in mind, is that we already seem to be kind of exceeding what we were just given as projections. So it's something for us to be keeping in mind and be thinking about that. I think the real surge wasn't really supposed to begin until another 2 or 3 years, perhaps, due to higher birth rates and the turnover of older homes and so on and so forth. So we're definitely exceeding the high projection at this point. The other thing to think about, and we can't go into great detail right now, is there's a lot of new construction kind of coming online in the north end of town. I think over the next decade or so, the projection was to add about 550 or 560 students to elementary level. The new construction alone in the north end of town is probably going to add something in that range, it seems. I don't think that all of that new construction was included in the SLR projection, but it would be good to know what I know that I'm forgetting the planner's name that did that for us, but I know she had mentioned a few of the projects that she had gone to the planning office to include in that, but I don't know that we ever saw a list of those. It'd be good to know exactly what was included in that projection. If I don't know if you could find that out, Chuck, at some point, that would be great. And then you already mentioned the South Windsor experience of how it basically the building of new schools created a more demand in that community for the education experience and boosted enrollment even further. So, those three things are kind of, something that we definitely need to be concerned about. So I'm wondering, wouldn't it make sense at this point for us to be looking at a cost that's, anticipating this growth already? If we maintain the current course, go forward with this scenario 6, and we're, at the end of the decade, we're at those projections, the high projections, never mind the higher projection right now, but the high projections, you have Doolittle is just over 100% capacity. The two new schools you're saying are right size, but I don't know if that means they're 90% or they 92%. I'm not sure. I guess my question is if we kind of have a pretty good sense right now that we're exceeding these projections, and there's good reason to think that we're going to be exceeding these projections, shouldn't we sort of be building for, I don't know what the percentage should be, but should we be planning for that, and what would those costs be?
Yeah, so thanks, John. To answer for the first two schools, we could just tackle that first. Certainly, if if there's growth in the district saying, hey, listen, we know what the projections were for this year and we're exceeding those, my first recommendation is, okay, let's have, SLR, their staff's kind of left, to be honest, just for FYI. But Rebecca's no longer with SLR, and it's kind of moved. So, but they're still around, the people that do it. We'd want to have those numbers updated and take a look at the whole district as a whole. And that's what we did in South Windsor. Each year, October 1 is when the districts have to report, I think, to the state SDE with the numbers, and they take those numbers and they update and they refresh. And it's not the same effort, because they already have the background data, and it's really just an update of the model. So that's the first thing I think, I would certainly encourage if that's happening, Jim, is one, we get them on board and update this fall, because it may go from a 650 school, 600 to 675. It may tick up a little bit where we have to adjust the anticipated size of the school, and it may take. And we have a high-low probable, in our analysis is early, and all these cash flows are taking the probable, so that they kind of keep that in mind. Let's take it in kind of the midpoint. But as we get closer to defining these projects, we'll want to update those enrollments for these two new schools, know what those are, and then finalize the budget based upon just that. It won't be based upon old numbers. You really need the newer numbers, because that 8-year cycle we've been talking about, if we submit grant applications, say June of 2022, year one is actually October 1 of 2022. It's not October of 2021, it's October 2022. So we want to refresh that in a district where there is growth, like if we have it. If it's a very stagnant, steady district, maybe not so much. But if you're growing, you want to update that. For the future ones, that's a little, obviously, the farther out we go, the less predictability we have. And I think SLR shared that that the high and low kind of diverge from the median. Again, it just goes back to monitor it year by year. If we think there's going to be growth and we're seeing activity and construction activity, we just have to monitor. So those later projects that come out, we have to adjust for those. And that's what we had to do in South Windsor for that.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. And I appreciate that each year we would be updating the numbers. I guess my concern is we have to go to a referendum based on a certain number. Don't we want to build in, assuming a certain amount of growth, maybe perhaps more growth than we're assuming now, because there's a relatively decent chance we're going to have to build a larger school at some point, and it may be relatively soon. It may even be, within the next 5 years when we're actually building the current new schools. I guess I'm saying, for planning purposes and for being as transparent as possible with the public, don't we want to try and figure out a way to kind of build in a bit of capacity there that we're probably going to use?
Yeah. So for the referendum number, and let's be specific, the referendum number we build is what we're going to submit to the state of Connecticut in a grant application. You can build it into your referendum. However, the state of Connecticut may say, hey, that's certain. If you did, they may say that portion is going to be ineligible until you justify otherwise. So if it's for 5 years down the road, we haven't seen districts that said, okay, we're going to add 10% for 5 years from now. That, if I misunderstand it, I apologize, but we wouldn't build in for 5 years out, because we're looking at an 8-year enrollment already. We're looking at 8 years out for that maximum already, for the size of the school. And again, having that dotted line for the additional space, God forbid, we're at the end of design a year later and numbers are continuing to grow, depending on what they do compared. But to add in for 5 years down the road, we haven't seen that. It just really just identifying what area on that site can we add if need be. You'd have to go, I think, for another referendum down the road to add on to that building, I think. I hope I answered that accurately.
Yeah, thank you. I guess, so is there a, I guess, let's say we overshoot the projections by, 200 students or something like that at the end of that, or it looks like we're going to do that at the end of the, 8-year projection.
Mhm.
How much more space perhaps would that need to add to a school?
If we have 200 more students,
Elementary level students.
okay. If it's for one school, for example, classroom size is what, 18 to 20, so, you're roughly 10 classrooms. Can depend. I think you also have to look at your cohorts and see, are there, not every cohort is going to be the same number of students per classroom. You're going to have variations between those. So I think you got to look at that a little bit and microanalyze those a little bit more to see, do we need 10 or do we need 8 or 9, for that. So.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barwi.
Yes, I take comfort in your answer that the state is going to have these numbers get updated before it's finally done. We will have them updated before we go out to referendum. I also have a question related to the comfort level and the numbers that are being used. And in the SMC report, you put a range of the cost of phase one, $72 to $87 million. And the finance directors told us that he used the high range in that. Does that range allow for some flexibility also in making some changes either direction a little bit?
Yeah, so the primary factors that go from the high to the low, on the low side, we use the actual space standard. So whatever the projection is in the square foot, that is the minimum size you want to build. That's what they're willing to reimburse. In our experience in these size schools for elementary schools, when we start going, we've seen as we start going through the educational specification and looking at your special resources, your special education, your ELLs, your reading, your support spaces that are in the 21st century learning model. They weren't, this space standard was developed many, many years ago. I can't speak to how they developed it, but many times we're seeing that the program is exceeding the space standard by a bit. We're getting into that 95, 96 percentile. So we're overbuilding for the space standard, but the educational specification in the program is supporting what we're looking to build. We did that in the phase 2 for the South Windsor schools. One, because of medically fragile program that went into one of the schools, an OTPT that wasn't back in the day probably considered, but now it is, and keeping those programs in district. I think that's a big, the state is in support of that, as we heard in their meeting. But so on the high level, we're adding 15%, just as, because we don't know what the ed specs, we don't know exactly what it is. So the low is the space standard, the high is another, I think we did 10 or 15% onto there. 15 we added on for those additional programs, just to kind of account for them. It probably just a shy bit less. Knowing the state said, if you're at 90% on a new, they're going to push back. They're going to say, you need to tighten it up and get us to 95, 96%. So, but the high and low has accounted for additional programming.
So the delta that they'll allow is fairly small, is about 5% from what the projections at the time of the application are.
Yeah, because they want it right sized. But they're not just looking at one school in itself. They're looking at holistically across your district, and they're also looking. What's good to see, we have projections from 2020. We update them to 2021. They're going to look at the history of these projections and go, "What's the district doing?" They're looking at the whole ball of wax and seeing what those trends are for it. So,
all right. And Are these, just one more moment, please. Are these the same people that are looking at other towns throughout the state? So they
They
have
look at
the
everyone.
experience of like a South Windsor that's growing crazy fast. And they
The
can
same
say, well, if
people.
that's happening, here's what you could do to work with it. So they're kind of our guide, and they have the examples of all the other communities as well.
100% correct. It's about 4 peoples. It's Director Casadiamantis, Michelle Dixon, who's a grant specialist. She's on all of these, and they have a couple project managers. They only have about 8 or 10 people in that office. It's not a really robust office, but it's the same people doing all of these applications, and they've seen a lot. They've seen a lot of different districts, a lot of different scenarios, and they're really truly highly qualified in this, and they've seen so much, and they remember a lot too, believe it or not. They remember every district, and they see the trends, and they understand the operations. I think that was demonstrated in our meeting with them, and their understanding of especially the special programs and that they keep in-house. So yeah, they're the same ones.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Boroway. So just to kind of maybe collar this a little bit, sizing of our schools is based on enrollment projections, correct?
Enrollment projections and the educational specifications are kind of combined at the hip. So
Correct.
yes.
But in this case, we're talking about capacity concerns. So in this case, it's obviously enrollment projections.
Correct.
So we've had an expert who does this. We're not experts, they're experts. They've done it, and we're working with their enrollment projections based on their expertise, and we're using their highest projections. Is that correct?
Well, I believe so, yeah.
Okay. And we're also limited as to what we can build and seek reimbursement for based on parameters that the state sets. They're not going to let you overbuild, as we've talked about. Mr. Walsh brought it up. We can't build a school to be at 70% capacity. We won't get reimbursement for that portion that may be 70 to 90. Is that correct?
Well, even more so, you won't get a grant application if you try to.
Correct.
It's not that you won't get reimbursed, is they won't put you on what they call the priority list, because they closely scrutinize the enrollment projections and the application to make sure you're right size. So if you're at 70%, you won't even start your project. You can do it, but you're not going to get reimbursement. Is what it comes down to.
So you're kind of making my point.
Absolutely.
So we're moving forward, right sizing this based on parameters that are in place. We've got experts making enrollment projections. We're working with the state of Connecticut to maximize reimbursement so that we can minimize the impact to our taxpayers. That's what we've done. And hopefully we're going to be working into this expansion potential, as we've talked about through our test fits, to make sure that if and when we get down the road, we need expansion in these facilities, that we have that capability, which at that point, we can pursue another round of reimbursement from the state because we will meet the parameters that they set to do so. Is that correct?
No, I would say that's correct.
Okay. So I understand Mr. Jink's concern. I think we're all concerned that we could miss the enrollment projections. But other than having a crystal ball, I'm not sure what we do. We've relied on experts. We're doing it the best way we can. We've hired experts on the enrollment side. We're working with the state of Connecticut, and hopefully we're going to be planning a project that provides for expansion in the event we run into an issue. And oh, by the way, as you said, we're going to look at this from a complete perspective of the town. It's not just one school. We have other schools that we can work on expanding other than the 2 new schools that we're building down the road, which could be in later phases, and then do some redistricting again 10 years down the road if you had to do that. So I'm not sure how we can do this and be 100% certain that we're going to meet the guidelines or meet whatever the enrollment actually is without a crystal ball. I think we've done everything we can. And SMC already went through this process. That's why they got to the position they got to. You have the same scenario, whether you do it with the 2 elementary schools or whether you do it with a middle school, you do it with a high school, you still have to design to the same specs, which means you can't overbuild. So I'm not quite getting Mr. Jink's argument here, but the facts are these are not supersized schools. We're building them to the right size based on what the experts are telling us. And, we keep hearing from people, we want a middle school project. Well, you want to talk about a supersized school. The middle school, in order to meet the enrollment projections, needs to be almost 1,200 students. The state has told us they don't like middle schools over 900. So to me, that sounds like a supersized building, not necessarily the elementary schools, which we've designed with experts to be right-sized. So that's how I see it. But I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on this. Ms. Pavano?
Hi. I think we have to trust you as our experts. I think that you have covered most of the things that we have concerns about, which is enrollment, and the educational layouts and all that kind of stuff. I think that you can throw out all kinds of questions, but I think you're answering all of them. You work with the state, you've done these projects many, many times, and I think that we have to trust you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pavano. We'll go to Mr. Slocum, then to Mr. Jenks, and then over here.
Mine was just a question that's probably in one of the books or pamphlets I didn't read through, but currently, and maybe Dr. Solon can speak to this, currently in Cheshire, how many households have children in our school system? I've always heard it's things like 30% or 34%. If that's accurate, has that number been a constant forever, or was it 50% in the 50s and 60s and 70s? I mean, are those trends really going to change that much? I guess that's a question that maybe doesn't mean a whole lot, but it might go to the additional homes that are in town proposed to be built. Is 20% of them have children in them potentially? Is it really the new housing number that really tells us implicitly that our schools are going to be overpopulated or underpopulated?
No, it's not. Sorry, Mr. Salamidi, to just jump on the mic with you there, but it's not exclusively the housing numbers. One of the things I was just referencing here on my phone was a previous presentation. This goes way back, October 14th, 2020, that I can share out, where SLR, at that point, Mylone and McBroom, did a nice job of illustrating the housing that was being built and the numbers that they were deriving from that. But it's also birth rates as well. Unfortunately, it's a good question, Tim, about the percentage of homes in Cheshire that have children attending our schools. I don't know that off the top of my head.
Right. Well, I think it's reasonable you wouldn't, but I know it's a concern with all the new housing proposed and are just recently built.
Sure.
And I think that's the genesis of some of these questions about capacity,
Yeah.
Because we see all these homes going up. And if in fact, you use a number like 30% of those new homes have, maybe it's 500 homes. That's only 150 homes with kids times two. It's 300 kids. I don't know what that really means over time, if every year that happens. But the bottom line is, I just don't know how frightening those numbers necessarily are.
Yeah. I don't think that, these numbers, and I don't think you mean like frightening Halloween
Well,
style.
I'm thinking in terms of just the expense to the community, in terms of the educational costs and managing the construction size of the projects going forward for the schools.
Sure.
That's all I mean.
Yeah.
That reason for concern or caution.
Yeah. I mean, I'll certainly share I'll send it to Sean, this presentation, which does really go into some detail there that I think helps illustrate, what does it mean when this Weiss Road project in terms of projected students, or this project in terms of projected students. So hope that helps. Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Slocum. Mr. Jenks?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So a couple things. Maybe I should just rephrase what I was trying to say earlier. So we know projection-wise, if we hit just the high projections, we're at about a 97% capacity for the elementary schools at the end of the decade. That was in the SMC report. That's what we talked about. What I was asking, I guess poorly, was knowing that we have likely upward pressure on our enrollment beyond that. Couldn't we plan to be in the 92, 93% capacity? How do we do that, I guess, is what I'm asking. Can we do that? I know we can't submit an application to be oversized. I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting we be right-sized and just making sure we be right-sized. These questions have nothing to do with scenario 2A. I didn't even mention scenario 2A. I'm just asking questions on scenario 6. I just want to make sure we're planning, if this is the route we're going, that we're considering all the things we consider in terms of planning for that potential future. And I hope you don't think that I'm challenging you in any way with any of these questions either. You're our experts, so I'm just asking. So thank you, Chuck.
As far as the percentage, when we finally get to doing the ed specs, right? We're talking the percentages and the ratios now, but once we get into the ed specs, we're not like backing in. There's not a calculation to kind of back into that. Again, it's a combination of the space standard. The state says that's what we can reimburse for statutorily. But then it's going to come back to the ed spec and work with the Board of Ed and going, okay, here's our enrollment, looking at the different grades and then seeing where that program falls out when you add in your admin, your gym, your cafeteria, and all your general classrooms and support, and then adding on our circulation space, our core space, we call it's unassignable, and then see where that falls out. So the ratio, the capacity ratio isn't so much of we don't calculate it per se. It's important, but we're making sure that we can, we have X amount of students with X amount of classrooms, for that 8-year high, and but it's also a balance with the square footage for the space standard. And it's not always kind of a one-to-one. One thing I found in looking at some of our past projects is when you look at the enrollment, and then when if I take your general classrooms, not art, not music, but just, kindergarten through 5 or 6, and we multiply it by, say, 24 students or 20, whatever the max is, a lot of times it's exceeded the actual enrollment. It could be a 803 capacity, but if I count the actual number of seats that we're buying the furniture for, it could be 900, it could be 925, depending on how they kind of weight out. So it's it's not always a one-to-one ratio, but no, I totally understand the concern. The key thing we have to understand is the state of Connecticut says you have 8 years. We only go out 8 years. We can't go out 10, unfortunately. And that's what we're restricted to.
So I guess for me, it's all about getting good information out to the public. And that's what we're trying to do in these meetings. And we talk about interacting with the public as much as we can. We've tried to do that, as I said, through the SMC process. I know the Board of Ed is doing it. The town council's doing it. We have all of the information relative to SMC posted on the town website. The Board of Ed has it. All of our meetings are public. You can certainly email us. You can certainly come to our meetings, and we will have a public comment section. So there's been some concerns that the public hasn't had enough input. We've provided many opportunities for that public input. We can only do so much if people don't want to engage. But it's really about getting the facts out. And what I'm particularly concerned about is, we are in election season. And I'm going to say something because I'm not running, so I guess I can get away with it. We're in election season. There's a lot of things on Facebook. And from what I can see, a lot of these things that are being posted are not based in fact. And what I'm trying to do is get the facts out tonight based on what our professionals are telling us and what SMC found through their 1.5 years of hard work and deliberation. And so, I caution people to believe what they see on Facebook because it's not always based in fact. If you want to get the facts, go to the information that we've posted, talk to the experts, and that's where you'll find the facts. So I just want to make that overarching statement because we're in a tough time. We are in election season, and there's a lot of things flying out on Facebook, and you probably all know some things you can believe and some things you can't. I caution you to seek out the facts yourself. We're giving you every opportunity to find them. Anything else from the kind of the test fit perspective, guys, that you want to talk about? I want to see if we can get into Humiston a little bit and what the time frame will be. I know you mentioned maybe in October, but we really need to kind of move things forward based on a timeline of trying to advance something. So what can we be doing to add in the Humiston option to whatever the phase 1 is and do that sooner than later? If we need to have some subcommittee meetings, I'm all for that. We can have the group Some of us partake in that. You know, we are having some higher level meetings with me and Tim and Dr. Solon and Sean, just to talk to you about kind of what's coming down the pike. And then we share it here in a public forum. But I'd like to be able to advance that Humiston analysis sooner than later. So I don't know how everyone else feels, but what I've heard from this council, at least the majority of the council, is we really want to look at that as an option in phase one. And the big reason from my perspective, as I said last time, is it checks off another very large ADA compliance issue, which I think we need to be doing. Tim?
Well, Rob, just to reiterate the time frame in reference to what you're talking about, getting those harder numbers on Humiston and the admin's piece of this. Just to remind everybody, we need that information by January, presumably, so you guys can put together everything. Council can take an action of some of necessary proportion so that this can be advanced to the state and to the public for a referendum, hopefully in April. And that has all to do with the timing of the state. So you get on their list, their to-do list. So this is why it's been a long process, but at some point it has to become a more hurried pace at this point. Deliberate, but hurried.
Well, I think people want to move something forward.
Yep.
We all do. And so I think that's what you're getting to towards that end. I think the community wants to be able to weigh in on this through a referendum vote. And I'm certainly hopeful that'll happen. So I agree with you, Mr. Slocum.
Whoever get along so good, Rob.
Yeah. What's that? You're going to miss me. The other question that came up, and I think this was from you, Mr. Bauer, and I don't mean to step on your toes on this, but I know you've heard this from some people in the community relative to the Norton School and talking about building a new facility there versus a potential build as new option or a renovation. Can you share with us kind of what the conversation was, if at all, during the SMC process as to evaluating, you know, renovating maybe potentially Norton as a renovate as new versus a new school, and why that wasn't, you know, chosen?
You saw the pros and cons between the two.
If in fact it was looked at, because I know Dave Bowery has interacted with some people in the South End who have said, you know, why don't we really like the school, you know, can we just renovate it? And I think there's some confusion as to, you know, if we're going to pursue state reimbursement, you have to renovate to something called renovate as new. So basically the entire building, when you're done, has to be a new facility. Even though it's renovation, it needs to look like a brand new building, and it needs to function as a brand new building rather than new roof, new air, you know, putting air conditioning and basically band-aiding it. So I'm just curious if the committee looked at those two alternatives: one, renovating as new versus a brand new school.
Yeah, I think we did. And I'm going to go off a little bit of memory here, so forgive me if there's a difference. But
and I will interrupt if you don't know and you want to send it to us or get it to us, that's fine. I know I'm putting you on the spot a little bit. That was
no, that's fine. Anytime, I mean, just in general, regardless if it's Norton or the schools, especially in an elementary school, because the children are younger. When we're talking renovation versus new, and this is in many districts, we keep going back to South Windsor where they were going to do a 1-2-1 with 2 new and 2 renovation, and ultimately went with 4 new. Really, it came down to a couple things. One is just an occupied construction for elementary school with young children in the school. Yes, do we do it safe? Is it blocked off and cordoned off? Is the contractor safe? Yes. However, it is a stress on the operations with the administration and the teachers, more so, frankly, the parents. The kids are resilient. It's the parents rightfully concerned about their 5-year-olds to what, 12, if I have my numbers right, 13 years old, being in on a live construction site and workers going back and forth in between. And we do the best we can to segregate, but there is always a possibility of crossing. So that's one aspect. To just the aspect of the unknown conditions in a school of that age, where obviously, I think we all understand there's hazardous materials in there that have to be abated. We can only do that really during the summer months, maybe during a winter break. But when kids are in school, the Department of Public Health, who governs that, really frowns upon that at that level. At the high school level, a little bit different. So that's an aspect. The duration of construction will be longer in a renovation, because you can only do parts and pieces of it at a time. Maybe, if you're, and that's if you have the swing space. The thing is we haven't even looked at it really in depth to analyze and going, do we have 6 to 8 classrooms at a time? Because anything less than, I think, 6, and this is just my opinion, what are we doing 4 classrooms for? All this, we're paying $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a month in general conditions to a contractor or a construction manager, if you will, to get a little bit done. That's a lot of overhead for a little bit of work, if you think about it. So in new construction, and I think Dr. Solon asked me, for a new construction, we're seeing those projects be roughly 16 to 18 months. With these buildings being done about 14 months, the building itself. And then it's that summer where we bring them over to the new school in that summer, abate, demolish, and redo the site, if you will. You saw in those test fits where we're proposing fields and parking. It's much cleaner versus, again, 24 months, probably potentially. I think we were looking at one was 27 months, maybe our last one. And again, it's very messy. A lot of times in elementary schools, we'll have the ceilings ripped out with just lights hanging and your smoke detectors hanging. Is it safe? Yes. Is it sightly? No. Again, I think the kids think it's cool. They walk around, they look at it, but it's, your administration, your staff, and teachers, or the parents. I'm sorry. So, and also, we're trying, and these old schools are great. We all know people are sentimental about them, but when you build a new school and you have that white piece of paper and you're programming it for that future, for that next 50 years, because the learning environment, Dr. Solon, I'm sure, can speak to it, is much different. The styles are different. Say in South Windsor, talk to them. They're so glad they went new. They're like, they don't look back and go, oh, we should have renovated. Renovate like new, just for the status, just for clarification. There's a statutory definition of it, and it says you have to renovate at least no more than 75% of the building that's at least 30 years old. So I don't think we have a problem there. However, it is a like new condition. You have to certify that all the mechanicals, the structural components, the seismic, they call it, is going to be like new. All code accessibility, all the, has to be up to date for ADA accessibility that we've been talking about. All your ITs there. So depending on, and we haven't dove into